Hello, listener, and welcome to That Implementation Science Podcast, the show that aims to reduce the innovation to implementation gap to 16 and a half years. I'm your host, Mike Pullman, and on today's show, I talk with co host Kevin King about fidelity measurement. We'll review a recent paper on the topic, weigh the pros and cons of different fidelity measurement methods, evaluate the fidelity of Kevin's banjo skills, and draw a picture with 1,000 words. If you like the show, the best thing you can do is tell your friends and colleagues. Tweet about it, post it on your socials, and add it to your Tinder profile. If you want to talk to us, we're on Twitter. I'm at ThatISPodcast, and Kevin is at KMKing_psych. I think you're really going to like today's show. Without further ado, let's get started.
So, Mike, I know you know this about me, but not many people know that I'm a devoted fan and I would say begin-intermediate practitioner of the Irish tenor banjo. So
Oh
I'm,
yeah, no, I know that, and I've heard you twanging away in my living room for
yeah,
sure.
that is true.
In
And
fact, I remember the year that your son was born. I asked you, "What do you look forward to in the year ahead?" And you said, "Learning my banjo scales."
that is true. Well, learning banjo scales is much more rewarding than many aspects of parenting a newborn, especially when they're crying and uh, ejecting fluids all over the place that you have to clean up. Not that parenting is ultimately not more rewarding than music playing. Well, and actually, I think like actually parenting and banjo playing have some parallels in a ways in that you like have some vision of what you're trying to do as a parent or as a banjo player. And a lot of parenting and a lot of music is about like striving towards that ideal you have in your head and not necessarily making it. And I've and really honestly with both, I've been thinking a lot about how the way we think about fidelity, this notion of fidelity in the field, there's just a lot of parallels to things in our real life. So whether it's me trying to properly execute timeout with my kids and wondering like, am I doing it right? What should I be doing differently? How is this actually working? Am I effective with this? Am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing? Or am I adapting to the circumstances of the moment? Did I make the right choice? There's all this like, at least for me, maybe there's not other people, but for me, there's always this like tape recorder in my head of like, of self-criticism that's always wondering, am I doing this right? And sort of more lighthearted frame, it's true with music too. You listen to music that you try to emulate, and you can play the notes right, but somehow even just like playing the notes doesn't always sound it right. You might not get the rhythm correctly, or maybe there's notes written on a page, but when you see somebody play, they add all sorts of extra stuff. They might add ornaments to it, or their rhythm is different than what it seems like if you just put the music from a computer. And there's this difference, between what you hope to be able to accomplish and maybe what you have in your head or what you see out there and where you actually are. And it makes me think about how hard it is to measure and think about fidelity and even sometimes define it in a sense. I don't know. Those are sort of random thoughts prompted by the article I think you sent
Yeah.
me
Yeah,
today.
totally, totally. I mean, I feel like for implementation science, obviously fidelity is one of the most important outcomes that we're looking at. It's essential for replicating or implementing something, because what we do is we have these studies that have been done on some sort of intervention. It's been shown to work somewhere, and then we want to replicate that. We want to make that happen in another setting, which means that you have to do it in the same way for it to replicate, right? We can't assume, there's this basic thing that I'm probably going to talk about a lot during this podcast, the principle of the uniformity of nature. And it undergirds all of science, really. The idea is that if something works once in a perfect context, in a perfect setting, done in a certain way, it's going to work again if it's done in that same context or setting and done in that same way, right? That doesn't change, that when you
Hmm.
drop a ball, it bounces on a cement and it bounces a certain height, and the same thing will occur. So fidelity is super important for that. A lot of people sort of argued about what fidelity meant, and I think now the field has kind of settled on the definition provided by Wendy Cross and Jennifer West back in 2011, which is that it consists of adherence and competence, right? With adherence being like, are you playing the notes the way you're supposed to be playing them, right? Or are you delivering the timeout in the way that you've been taught or read that it works? And then competence, which is, are you doing it in a skillful way? So are you adding that swing when you play those
Hmm.
notes, right? The very slight pauses that maybe can't even be noted on the musical sheet, or maybe the flourishes that you want to add that
Hmm.
actually aren't written down at all, but that actually make the song a little bit better. Or the times when, like, maybe technically your son needs that timeout, but you know that if you
Hmm.
give a smile and a wink instead, it's just going to help the situation and help them learn in a much better way.
Hmm. The way you describe that, I mean, when I agree, it strikes me that competence is really hard. And competence, there's some things you can write in a manual, right? And it seems like, and again, you're more expert than I am, so maybe you can say more clearly, how accurate this is or where this falls short. But it really makes me think that a lot of what we write in manuals is about adherence. And it's a lot easier to talk in a scientific report about adherence. And yet maybe competence is really the magic sauce that really drives it and really makes it come alive. Am I missing something there?
No,
Is that on point?
some people argue that for sure, but I think I like to think of competence more as kind of the ambient rhythm in the room, the ambient noise that
Hmm.
like everyone that is producing an intervention expects you to already have, right?
Hmm.
So they expect, so when you're learning, let's say trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, they're maybe focused on adherence. The competence is all the stuff that like you should have learned at like the help in your helping relationship class
Hmm.
or in your work on like how to provide empathic communication and
Hmm.
stuff like that, which in some ways kind of adherence itself, but like is just kind of understood as competence. And I know some people would
Hmm.
disagree with me on this. Oftentimes, too, though, I think it's referred to as like kind of the art side. But I feel
Hmm.
like competence can be rated and can be judged still, and you kind of know it when you see it. And this kind of gets us to this paper that we're looking at right here is
Hmm.
that, fidelity, because it plays such an important role in implementation science, we have to measure it, right?
Hmm.
Because you have to know whether or not the intervention that you're doing is being done in an adherent way to how it was originally done, and whether it's done in some sort of with some sort of competence. But the
What can I
problem,
can I interrupt you there for a
please.
second? You say it has to be done, and maybe the whole field's on board with that. But I got to say, are there people that argue you can't do fidelity, you can't measure it because every case is different, and every client that I see or everybody I supervise, they need a different thing, and you can't possibly pin me down to one sort of recipe cookbook of what I'm supposed to do every time.
I mean, there are some
Tell me
people,
about those arguments.
there's these meta-analyses out there where people have looked at all these different psychotherapies and they all have roughly the same effect size and
Mhm.
say, okay, the secret sauce is actually working alliance. That's oftentimes
Mhm.
bantered about. And working alliance could be, I think, by some people considered a form of competence, right? How are you forming that working
Mhm.
alliance? And so, yeah, I think that argument could be made. I was talking more about fidelity being essential for the scientific concept of the principle of the uniformity of nature, right?
Mhm.
Which is that if you're going to take something that's been proven to work in one setting and apply it to another setting, and you're going to do that, you're going to have to follow the original rules out as it was
Yeah.
laid out. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't adjust that, doesn't mean there can't be adaptations. And in fact, maybe those adaptations are even more effective than it was originally done in that
Mhm.
original setting. But if you hope to achieve those effect sizes at a bare minimum, you're going to have to be following the protocol as it was originally laid out.
Mhm.
Just like if you want the basketball to bounce the same number of feet high on the ground, you have to drop it from the same height. You can't drop it from a lower
Mhm.
height and expect it to bounce up in the same way
Mhm.
because that's the basic principle of uniformity of nature. Now, there are probably some people, metaphysical people, who don't believe in the principle of uniformity of nature, and even some physicists have kind of questioned that. I don't even want to get into that because if we start thinking about that too hard, it throws all of our jobs out the window.
Yeah, I never would want to pretend to be a physicist or any sort of physical scientist. Or a philosopher by that means. So I can avoid both of those extremes. I mean, I ask in part because I've thought a lot about this question of fidelity when it comes to statistical analysis and when it comes to replication. These are conversations that are happening in the open science and replicability movement all the time. And I think you hear a couple of arguments, from I will say from quantitative people, they say, oh, well, you couldn't possibly do a fidelity measurement for regression or a multi-level model or any specific statistical analysis because every model and every data set is unique and you have to be able to adapt and adjust and you couldn't possibly standardize what these things are. Everything we do is art. I mean, it's a statistical art, but that's sort of what it ends up sounding like. Personally, I disagree. I think we could write a fidelity manual that would cover 80% of the cases, 80% of the time, and then the rest of it is like there's competence knowing how to adapt. The other way it comes up, which I think is interesting, is in replication studies. There's like examples in replication where there's notable replication failures. The assumption, I think, is that your fidelity manual for any one experiment or any study is the manuscript, right? It's supposed to tell you everything that they did so that you can replicate the experiment. And it turns out when people investigate a lot of replication failures, it finds out there's a lot of things that sometimes the investigators knew or really think matters because they've piloted their experiment a whole bunch, but they didn't have space to write in the paper. And then there's even other, to me, even more interesting examples where replication failures were only uncovered by like intensive work by the scientists to figure out what exactly was the difference. I remember one case where apparently it was in some sort of microbiology or chemistry lab where they even had investigators visiting each other's laboratories and they could not figure out why the protocols wouldn't replicate across labs. And it turns out they had the same centrifuge made by the same manufacturer, but in different years. And it turns out the centrifuges spun at different rates. And it was the difference in the spinning rates that caused the replication failure. So I just sort of want to give some background for what I'm thinking about when I think about fidelity and like what's the causal effect, because there's a lot of other fields that are sort of wrestling with what's this key ingredient that
Yeah,
that
well,
is actually driving our effects.
I'm reminded of Jurassic Park when Jeff Goldblum is talking about chaos theory and drops the little drop of water on his fist and it goes one direction and he drops another one and goes a different direction or something. I don't know if I'm remembering exactly, but the point being is that yes, there are an infinite number of variables and we can't keep track of all of them. And to try to follow a single manuscript is quite difficult and it's probably one of the reasons why we have a bit of a replication crisis. And we should definitely dedicate an episode of this podcast to the replication crisis because I think there's a lot to unpack there. However, we have to take steps in that direction. And one of those steps is to try to ensure, again, that the intervention that's being done is being done with some fidelity. Yeah.
For sure. And Mike, I just got to tell you, every episode for me is an episode about the replication crisis. You're just not going to be able to get me off that horse.
No,
But
I mean,
let's
please do. Yeah. I mean, so I've told you this before, and I'll say this again in our episodes as well. I think of implementation science as a form of something broader that probably doesn't even exist, but that I'm calling replication science. Does such a
Mhm.
thing exist? Is there a replication science? I mean, because
Well, you could
every
put science after anything and make it sound
right and
impressive. So
make
sure,
it
it exists
exactly
now.
it
Look
is
at
now.
that.
All right, and I am the leader of replication science.
Yep.
I don't
I'll
know a
start the
lot about it.
newsletter.
I know exactly. But because like every implementation is a form of replication, and in fact, I think if the fields of replicate, the people who study replication and people who study implementation got together, I think there could be some real
Mhm.
magic there.
For sure.
Because some of the language, we talk about, for instance, the difference between a conceptual replication versus a practical replication versus, all these different types
Hmm.
of replications. And those have real pragmatic differences in terms of how we're running our trials. And when we run an implementation trial, how we might speak about them and
Hmm.
interpret why we may or may not find the effects that were found in an
Yeah.
original trial, for sure.
No, I like that framework. That's a really cool framework. So let's talk about this article
Yeah.
that you sent. So I'll give it a shot at describing what they did and why it
Yeah.
was important,
Yeah.
and
Why
then
don't we name it and name the authors first?
you tell me, yeah, why it's terrible. So this is called Improving the Feasibility of Fidelity Measurement for Community-Based Quality Assurance, partial versus full session observations of supervisor adherence and competence. Now, this comes in the journal Implementation Research and Practice. and it first appeared online in November of 2022. The first author is Jason E. Chapman, and co-authors are Zoe Alley, Sonia Schoenwald. And that may be all. I have to click on View All
Yep.
Authors. Yes, so it's Chapman, Alley, and Schoenwald. And this is a cool study. I don't, like I said, I don't know implementation all that well, but I love measurement and I love this kind of stuff because this is a study questioning like what's the best way to measure fidelity to intervention using real live observations or observations of live recordings of supervision sessions, right? This was a study that was a controlled trial of multisystemic therapy, MST. This is an evidence-based treatment that's fairly well known. I could not tell you what it's about personally, but I know it's evidence-based. There's a
There's
good body
therapy
of research,
involved. There's multiple systems.
multi-systems. Yeah, exactly. And so this was an RCT of this, and this study looked at how supervisors of therapists, what their level of fidelity was for basically providing supervision for therapists giving MST. Now, it's important, this supervision thing is important, my understanding in implementation science, because this is one of supervisors are often a target of implementation. From what I see from the implementation science side is a lot of people saying, look, we can target therapists, but there's a lot of them. And so we can maybe have more impact if we actually train train the supervisors, because otherwise we're having a bunch of therapists come to, they need the expert supervision. They're the ones who need the training. They're the ones. So this is almost, it reminds me, and maybe you would see this differently. It reminds me a little bit of a train the trainer model.
Yeah.
And
And
yeah,
one of
go
the
ahead.
nice things about MST that needs to be said is that they have a pretty rigorous supervision model, right? So their supervisors are highly trained and they follow a pretty rigorous protocol as compared to many other therapies.
Yeah. And so in this study, they rated audio tapes from 374 sessions from these 57 supervisors. And the question here, and this is one of the things I love, the question here is, can you get good fidelity ratings from partial sessions and different kinds of partial sessions rather than just scoring the full session?
And why would that be a good question? Why do we need to answer that question?
Dude, have you ever listened to a full therapy or supervision
Oh my
session?
God, too many times.
Yeah. I have myself having supervised, and supervising is delightful. It's really, really wonderful, but it's one of those things you kind of need to do once, right? And so actually, listening to entire therapy sessions or entire supervision sessions every time, it's just cost ineffective. And if we're going to implement any of these treatments at scale, we really have to find like what's the quickest and dirtiest way we can actually get good information
Mhm.
from folks. And
Probably good both for research as well as for supervision practice. So supervising the supervisors, right, for a real practical
mhm,
implementation, but also for research, for knowing what might be leading to good practice in therapists, but just how expensive it would be to listen to every single supervision tape and code that on adherence and competence or fidelity as opposed to some other method.
right. Now, before we get into sort of how they did it and what they found, because they had a couple of cool findings and a couple of cool things that they compared. Maybe it's obvious, but maybe Mike, could you say why don't we just like have the supervisors say what they did? I do a lot of self-report research in my line of work. In fact, a lot of what I do, the way I might do a study like this, if you just took my methods, would be right after the supervision session, I would have the supervisor rate what they did and maybe even just describe what they talked about. After the session, I might have the supervisor write down what they did because I want to get, recordings of behaviors. So why not do something like that? It'd be a lot cheaper. You could have a mobile device, checklist, something. Why not do
Totally.
that?
Well, we do that all the time for Fidelity. We have people maybe complete a checklist or a self-rating, or maybe describe what they did in an open-ended form, and maybe that's coded. All of these things are highly feasible methods and highly efficient methods, right? But may not be highly reliable or highly valid measures. And the main reason is that, unfortunately, these people that we work with are human beings, and human beings suck because they have biases. I don't know about you, Kevin, but I oftentimes think that the product that I created is better than the product that somebody else has created because I created it and it's so beautiful and wonderful to me. And I know I did it so well, right? Even though maybe I didn't actually do it really well or as well as I thought. I mean, we have these areas of unawareness about ourselves and our behaviors and our actions. And so we're just not very good self-reporters of the things that we think we're doing, especially if we're being held up as some sort of a test, right? Even whether it's for researchers or for our employers, if we think that we're going to be evaluated on something, we may inflate a little bit what that thing is in terms of how well we thought we did it.
For some things, the bias self-report's good enough. So for a lot of the work that I do, the evidence is that people are fine. They're not perfect, especially in the work I do, like they're rank order consistent. So, there's been some cool studies about like can people accurately report how much marijuana they're smoking? And, it turns out people are not great at guessing number of grams that
I,
they've
f-
smoked.
I feel like the more marijuana that they smoke, the less accurate they're going to
Well,
be.
that's also, yes, that's also a finding. But there's been some really cool work out of Colorado where people actually did research in a pot shop, and it turns out people are pretty bad. They're biased at how much they would roll a joint, how much pot they would put in a joint, but they were rank order consistent. So the people that said they like rolled fatter joints, consistently guesstimated, more marijuana than people who rolled thinner joints. So, there's stuff like that. But I could see with this, it's a lot more important that you get a really accurate sense of what people are actually doing in a session, because you could imagine things like performance feedback and client outcomes. There's all sorts of like real, like if you're getting a biased sense, and if people are over reporting, this might be one of those things where the measure becomes the target, and then all of a sudden you're not people are over representing how good they're doing because they know what you want to hear, and then your trial isn't working as well as you want, or your patients aren't getting better. Versus doing, videotape feedback of some kind, you both get a sense of what they're doing and you can see opportunities for intervention and training and sort of, hey, I noticed you doing this and let's
Mhm, mhm.
work on this
Now,
skill.
now there have been other options besides self-report or observation. Like those are the two extremes, right?
Hmm.
And one is the cheapest, but probably the least valid, I would guess, and the other one is the most expensive, but and
Hmm.
probably the most valid. There have been options where they've used vignettes, and then they have kind of a pop quiz about what would you do next as a
Hmm.
therapist, or how would you handle this situation.
Hmm.
There's been situations where they have mock participants. In fact, I was involved in a study with Shannon Dorsey, our colleague, our good
Hmm.
friend and colleague, where they used behavioral rehearsals, and they had therapists complete these over the phone with research assistants who were trained to behave like clients. And then we took those recordings and actually coded those. And so there are other options.
Right.
But I think those options exist on a continuum, right? Basically, of expense and difficulty and quality.
Yeah. And of course, the challenge with mock recordings, and model patients, which I've also done some work with like motivational interviewing and model patients, and is you sort of get one shot at it, right? Versus either self-report or videotape sessions, you can you can use this as behavioral improvement markers or as like practice. So what's cool about this study is they compared, from what I can tell, three different ways of recording sessions and compared it to the full session score. So they had you sort of would view the full supervision session and rate it for fidelity, get a score for what it is for each of the supervisors, and then they looked at, okay, what does it look like if we just randomly grab 15-minute sessions from people? What if we look at the very first case they have, right, fresh out of training, ready to roll? If we just supervise the first case and get the look at the full sample of the first case, and what if we just get a partial sample of that first full case?
Well, so I was a little confused by this, and maybe we need to look at this together. I think that they were having supervision sessions. And that first case one was that they looked at the very first case they
In the
reviewed
supervision
in
session.
during that super because they said
That's
the
right.
average length of time was 11 minutes for that.
Hmm.
So that's what tipped me off. They're like, oh, they're not just talking about their first case fresh out of school or fresh out of training. They're talking about the first case in that supervision session, which may have differed from tape to tape. It may have been a different first case versus, and so like that's a feasible thing. Let's just listen to the supervision tape, listen to the first case
Hmm.
and code on that versus let's take a randomly. And I think they were just trying to come up with something that's more feasible than a random 15 minutes if it was applied in the real world.
Yes. And I think what's confusing about this is they have these figures where they talk about first case partial
Yes.
sample
Yes.
and first
So
case full sample. What's the
that,
difference?
yeah, I think, and I never quite figured this out for sure. I think the first case partial means they took one first case rating per supervisor
Yeah.
versus the full sample was they took one first case for every single session that the supervisor
Right.
submitted. Yeah.
So the problem with that is they didn't need to do that. And
Yeah.
they should have just done the full
Yeah.
sample and corrected for clustering and multi-level
Yeah.
modeling. And
Well, they
maybe the
did they did correct for
authors,
clustering, but I think they were hoping to get maybe more tighter statistics. But
Mhm.
yes, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
No, yeah, I recognize they did that. I just want I sometimes you get this sometimes where reviewers are like, I don't know about this multi-level modeling. Let me just see it with one at a time. Let me
yeah,
just
yeah,
so I could see that sort of
yeah.
happening. They get anxious about the shrinkage that happens in multi-level modeling. Frankly, who doesn't get anxious about shrinkage?
We all do.
Um, but yeah, so what's cool about this is they have these beautiful visualizations. I don't know, in one line of my research, I don't know if you know this, but I've really gotten into data visualizations. I've had this outstanding graduate student, Connor McCabe, who got really interested in helping the field do a better job of visualizing interactions. Because nobody can look at a table and sort of say, oh, alpha times beta is 0.013, and that's significant. I know what that means. Nobody can read that. Let me correct that. I could read that and I could tell you what it is because I'm a total quant nerd. But your average researcher, they don't know how to interpret that, and they shouldn't. It's ridiculous. So we worked on improving visualizations, and I won't say more about what that is, but I love these visualizations because it accomplishes, I think, all of the things that you want in a good visualization, except a couple. But it gives you just with one glance, it gives you exactly what you want to know from their finding and exactly the finding. So they have these, you can look it up. I recognize this is a podcast, so it's really terrible for me to describing a visualization. Next, I'm going to try to tap dance about architecture, and we'll see how that goes. So you can imagine the X and the Y axis, and essentially there's a straight diagonal across the X and Y axis that represents the reference, which is what you would get if you coded the full supervision case, right? So the X axis and the Y axis go from 0 to 1, and it's relating the full session score to the partial session score. And so you can imagine like a perfect 45-degree angle is, a correlation of 1, and that's their reference. And then overlaid across that, they have these great other visualizations of the lines of what happens when you code a 15-minute segment, what happens when you code, and then what happens when you code just the first case. And it gives you very clearly sort of how close or far away those sort of different ways of sampling fidelity, how close or far they are from the full session score. And the short answer is they're good but not great. That's how I would interpret it. They're both sort of, somewhat depressed lines, not at a 45-degree angle. And importantly, there's very little difference among them. It kind of doesn't matter whether you look at the 15-minute score or just look at the first case. You sort of seem to get about the same information.
Well, and the way that they're not great is really important as well, in that those scores that came from the samples, the partial, basically the not full recording, when those scores were high, they overestimated the real score. And when those scores were low, they underestimated the real score. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. So you also get some information about sort of bias, right? This is something we think of in testing and sort of really just model fitting in general, right? Where is there a sweet spot where your model's really predicting the outcome really well? And like you said, are there spots which all is very common at the extremes, like are you over predicting or under predicting so that your guess is going to be wrong and is your guess wrong in a sort of reliable direction because your model is reliably wrong?
hmm Now, one thing I thought was like if you know what those are and you have good predictions for that, even though I recognize there's standard error on either side of that, but if you have those, you could still engage in these shorter coding sessions and then actually statistically adjust your rating to better fit what reality was. Could you not?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question I would have, and this is actually okay, I will go back to, what I wish there were in visualizations like this is some better sense of uncertainty, right? So if
Yeah.
we have the confidence bands around these, and also the data, because sometimes you get this poorer prediction when you don't actually have a lot of people and this is very common with these things, like you might not have a lot of people at the extremes. It's possible that there weren't a lot of people who had very high fidelity scores or very low. I might expect in a trial like this, there's not a lot of people with very low fidelity scores. But if you did have enough data in these models and you could reliably show bias, you probably could do some kind of bias correction on it.
hmm
Or even again, if we think about this as a practical tool, right? If I'm a supervisor and I sort of say I do a snippet and I see somebody like doesn't look that great, I might say, their fidelity looked pretty high, and maybe it's even higher than it is. If I know sort of what neighborhood I'm expecting to see bias high or low.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. All right, so major take home here is that, as we saw before, the more energy and effort you put into fidelity coding and observation, the better quality it's going to be. And that retains here. But that doing some sampling does retain, some validity, but with some bias, especially at the extremes. But I'm going to throw a curveball at you. And I didn't recognize this until I probably looked at this paper for the fourth or fifth time, and I spent a lot of time like digging into it. Could this effect simply be due to regression of the mean? And here's where I'm going with this. In those shorter sessions where they're sampling, where they're only coding a sample, right? You're going to have more random error, right? And that random error is going to be biased in certain directions on either side of the curve, right? And this should fit exactly as we'd expect, where the random error is going to be biased in a way that it's going to be the true mean is going to be lower than what you'd expect at those high angles, and higher than what you'd expect at those low angles, at those low edges, right? And so this probably occurs in fact, it definitely occurs in every kind of sampling that we always do. It's why sampling more is better, because we're always tightening those errors on either side of the curve. But the fact is that those errors are going to be in a certain direction on the higher end versus the lower end of the curve. Do I have this right, or am I getting this wrong?
No, I think you could be totally right. Um, yeah, I mean, it's really possible that, and I think this is something where descriptive statistics would really, I've been looking through the paper and I don't really
Yep.
see
There's
them to
no
really
mean.
understand like what's the real distribution.
Yep.
You run into these problems I mean, statistical problems, not like problems in a lot of fidelity trials, or at least in my experience, where you train people up to competence and you're sort of only looking at the higher end of competence because you've trained them and, they come out well. It's not what we're not taking people off the street and say, read this MST manual and then, okay, there's a patient, which, I mean, maybe that's something we ought to try as as a field. So maybe there's range restriction coming into play. I mean, I keep wondering about the distribution of variables, like, how much representation is there? I'm assuming they're treating everything as normal, and maybe these distributions are really non-normal, non-linear, because maybe sometimes they're bounded by 0 and 1, and when have that happen, there's all sorts of funky interplays that can happen between variables. But to your point, it's really possible that you see some of this overestimation, underestimation, like you said, just because when you're sampling a snippet, and if somebody looks worse than usual or worse than other people, then maybe what you're looking at is a particularly bad session or particularly rough session, and they actually get better. And I think vice versa could be true. You brought up this idea of like, could you have a bias correction on this, right?
Yeah.
And, if you were to use this in practice, what you might do is when you get fidelity scores from samples that are particularly outside the range of certainty, right? So like I alluded to this earlier, but in this measurement framework called item response theory, you think about tests and items giving you, they talk about this item information curve or test information curve. And the idea is like in a certain area range of like fidelity, for example, our test can give us a lot of information. And then when you're outside of that range, our test is not actually not very helpful. So if this was like a fidelity test, right, on MST, just imagine you had a fidelity test on MST that had people sort of check off how much knowledge they have of MST. If I gave that test if I went across the street to the bus stop for the number 8 in Seattle, and I gave it to somebody standing at the bus stop, they're going to fail all those
Well, they'll
items.
probably stab you first, and then they'll fail all those items.
Yes, probably in that order, which just shows you how both violent and conscientious people are in Seattle, because they will both stab you and take your wallet, but then fill out your survey, which I find quite refreshing. And that's just because they have no exposure. There's no reason to expect them. So that test is useless for a random schmo waiting for the number 8, but it might be useful, for somebody who's been to an MST training, right, or in the beginning of an MST training. So that's a little bit of the idea of information and how tests give you information just about a certain part of a theoretical distribution. And maybe that's something that we're seeing here too, is that the partial sessions give you more information in certain ranges of fidelity than others. Again, I think it's something that I couldn't answer by just looking at this study, but these are the things I think about. So that makes me think that, if you get one of these scores that's sort of outside of the optimal information range for this measurement method, you could just use it as a prompt. Not to say we know something about this person, but say, let's get more information.
It's a screener. It's a 15-minute screener if you're
Yeah,
applying this to like clinical work.
yeah.
And then you know whether or not you need to do a deeper dive. I think that's an excellent point. I think that's an
Mhm.
excellent point. And I think these
Yeah.
kinds of like sampling for fidelity can do that. Not particularly helpful for research all the time, though. When in
Mhm.
research studies, we do want really good reliability at all ends of the scale. Although I
Mhm.
recognize we don't always have that. In fact, usually we don't have that.
Though you could extend that, right? So imagine you do a study and you have the most cost-effective design is we're going to go into the field and we're going to measure fidelity. And you use the same principle that, if Mike, I view one of your sessions and you get a score that's right in the sweet spot, then I'm done. I don't need to see any more. And you have an adaptive design where for people who are sort of, you don't get a good estimate for, you go observe more and more sessions until you get a reliable trait estimate of fidelity. You could also imagine a design that does that for everybody, but then only uses as many measurements as you need to get something that's reliable. That could be, I don't know if people have done that, but that's just something you could apply even in research.
Hmm hmm I agree. All right, well, there you have it, Fidelity. Are there any, I mean, I recognize we're kind of running out of time here. Are there any other things that you want to talk about, either regarding this paper or just regarding Fidelity and implementation science in general?
I don't think so. I feel like we've just scratched the surface on
Hmm
fidelity and all of these questions about what is fidelity and how do you get at it. I just want to compliment the authors on this paper for writing a really neat paper and really, showing how you could do this. And I think thinking about some of the questions we all think about when we're designing studies or even doing interventions is like, do I have to, do I really have to? And like, what's the best way? I feel like there's so little good information about, these sometimes feeling like arbitrary study design choices. Like, can I get away with 15 minutes of supervision? Do I need to do an hour from my measure? Do I have to do an observational measure, or can I rely on self-report? Or, I mean, there is good research out there, but I feel like every study like this that's about some of these methodological choices, it's important and frankly under-recognized, I think, by funding agencies. There's not a lot of funding agencies that want to sort of nail down these methods. They want the sort of spiderweb models that pretend that we have causality and really help us understand. But I think, just to get back on my soapbox, one of the reasons we often have a problem is we haven't spent enough time doing work like this, really figuring out how much information are we getting from our measures? Are our procedures really working the way we think they're working? Are we measuring the things we think we're measuring? So I just think it's really cool to see work like this, and I'm happy to highlight it on our
Yeah. Totally,
podcast.
totally agree. Love this work. I've been aware of Jason Chapman's work for a long time now because of my colleague Shannon Dorsey, and then Sonia Schoenwald is of course just a legend in the field, more broadly read as well as and especially now in implementation science. And so it's fantastic. In fact, we should try to get both of them on the show at one point or another. I agree, and I feel like the real questions that people have to ask themselves around fidelity and just measurement are no different than what we ask around measurement in general, which is how important is it to our study? And therefore, and then that should be related to how reliable and valid do we want this measure to be.
Mhm.
And it's always going to cost more money and be more burdensome and more intensive to get more reliable and valid data. Of course, it's not a perfect correlation. There may be some loss at the top or at the tail end of those things. I do really like this idea of kind of trying to balance. The really intensive expense of observation by just
Mhm.
taking samples. And I love that we now have data to see exactly what the association is between what the real score would be and what a sampled score would be in
Mhm.
that situation. And I might suspect that these exact same results would apply to a clinical intervention rather than supervision. I don't see any reason why they wouldn't generalize.
Yeah.
Oh,
The only caveat I'd put on that is I think we're looking at a special case here where the validity is kind of understood and known, right? We're looking at, like, the question is like, is the supervisor in the session doing what they're supposed to be doing? And we can observe them doing it and rate, are they doing what they're supposed to be doing? So we have a fairly straightforward one-to-one correspondence with our sense of validity and the measure and what we can observe, right? It's close to what I would say is objective measurement, because you can sort of count behaviors and look at people, and it's literally, you're not just taking a snippet out of even, daily life. You're sort of looking at the thing they're supposed to be doing while they're supposed to be doing it. There's lots of other examples where, sometimes the more expensive measurement is actually worse because the validity work hasn't been done on it. So I think I would just caution the audience to really think carefully about what we really know about what we're measuring, and how what we think we're measuring, how well does it actually correspond to what we're using to measure it. That's just sort of my plug from a measurement nerd side.
I think that's totally well taken. I think it's an important aspect. And sometimes in implementation science, we're forced to build the wings on the airplane while it's in flight, right? And that oftentimes we're faced with a situation where a fidelity measurement does exist or does not
Mhm.
exist, or if it does exist, we don't know the psychometrics for it. And frankly, like oftentimes in these complex interventions, we don't even know which of the aspects of the complex intervention are the effective components, right?
Right.
So what parts of the fidelity are actually important? And so again, we're kind of putting the wings on the plane as we fly it, and we're kind of faced with that dilemma. But it's what we have to do.
Right. Otherwise, we'd be spending 5 years at a time testing each individual mechanism, and we 50 years later we'll find out the one that works, and
Yeah.
everybody who it matters to will have moved on anyway. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a real challenge. I agree.
Thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's show. If you liked today's podcast, please share it with your friends, colleagues, and lovers, regardless of their fidelity status. If you agreed with our comments today, you can sing our praises on Twitter at @ThatISPodcast or KMKing_psych. If you disagreed with our comments, please feel free to post about it on Truth Social. All of the comments and opinions expressed during today's show are our own. They are well-reasoned and insightful, and therefore are not necessarily endorsed by our grant funders or employers. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you next time.
You tell me, yeah, why it's terrible.